So before we start reading the Crucible in class tomorrow, it's important that you get some background information on it. So this PowerPoint is going to walk you through a little bit about the Puritans themselves, a little bit about the witch trials, and ultimately working our way towards Arthur Miller and what he's trying to do with the Crucible. So, for starters, let's find out a little bit more about the Puritans. So first of all, they came to America to avoid religious persecution. They wanted to be free to worship the way they believed, and England was not allowing them to do that. But they didn't want religious freedom for everybody. That we hold that as like the gold standard, and that's not what they came for. So you would think people who were fleeing religious persecution would be more open to um, alternate alternate religions and whatnot, but that's not exactly the case. One of their beliefs was in the total depravity of man. Essentially, they thought man was evil and most likely going to hell. They thought it was predetermined, you were predestined to go to heaven or hell, but they thought, why tempt it? So that fed into their moral code of wanting to be God's perfect servants at all times. They set up their community here in America as what they call the city on a hill. Basically, it means that they want to be a shining example for everybody, and if you're on a hill, you're above everybody else. They really believed that their way of life and their church was going to bring them closer to God, and they believed that it was their duty to spread that as far and wide as they could. They set up primarily an agricultural community. This was, North America in the 1600s. There was nothing here, so they were farmers mostly, which can explain quite a bit about how their life was the way it was. These were not people who were working cushy office jobs. Their life was hard. These were the pilgrims that we think of. One other final very important thing uh, in this book is to know that children and women were really highly repressed in the Puritan society. They didn't have any rights. Girls especially didn't even go to school, and children were better to be seen and not heard. And that's ultimately going to have some effects, particularly on girls, as it relates in this play at least. In the 1600s in Salem, they were governed by a theocracy. You may have heard that term before, but it comes from obviously ocracy, which is that standard uh, root for government. And it starts with theo, which means God or theology. So a theocracy is government through and by God. Everything in Salem, all of their laws were governed by the church. They did not have this separation of church and state that the revolutionaries in the 1700s prized. Had ongoing settlement issues, conflicts with the Native Americans, people arguing over who owned what. This was a brand new community, and they were suffering sort of generalized growing pains. Um, there were always new people coming in. They were starving because they were, farmers, and it was the winter time, and they faced these harsh conditions. So life in Salem in the 1600s wasn't easy, and that helps us understand these people a little bit better. Um, in a theocracy, the pastor of the church is generally in charge. Everything is going to happen in that church building. That church building is going to be the center of the community. The pastor of the church would be the one in charge of enforcing the laws at a local level. Salem witch trials actually ran from February 1692 to May of 1693, so a little over a year from start to finish. And what they were, essentially, was a series of hearings to prosecute individuals accused of witchcraft. Over 150 people in the Salem, Massachusetts area were accused of witchcraft, and ultimately 26 of them went to trial. All 26 of those were convicted. Because of this thing called spectral evidence. So spectral evidence, spectral comes from the word specter, and that meant that Saying something was done by a supernatural power was upheld by the court as proof. So you could stand there in court and go, ow, 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 she's pinching me. And she's like clearly like 20 feet away in the courtroom. But then you could say, well, her spirit did it. And in Salem in the 1600s, the court was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's totally possible. Sure, she's a witch, she's convicted. Ultimately, of the 26 that went to trial and were convicted, 19 of them were executed by hanging, and one of them was pressed to death. The other six ended up not getting hanged for various reasons. I suspect because they happened sort of at the end when it was kind of dying off. So, what are some potential explanations for this? Hysteria. You know, we can sit here in 2017 and say, "Oh my God, these people are crazy. How could they have believed that this spectral evidence was real? How could they have believed that witchcraft existed?" Well, history has come up with some explanations, and Arthur Miller in particular has bought into a couple of them. One of the explanations is that medical conditions were causing these symptoms that were attributed to the supernatural. So, obviously, if somebody says, "Oh my gosh, I feel so sick to my stomach," you know, she's doing it to me by her spirit, that obviously could have just been she ate something bad for her. In fact, one of the theories has to do with the wheat that they were growing, and potentially that it might have been moldy and that could have caused some hallucinations that some people were having. Um, Another explanation is what you might have learned about in psych called the psychosomatic response, and that's the connection between the mind and the body. If you believe badly enough that a symptom is happening or that you have some sort of disease, you can physically cause your body to have a physical response to it, and that is a potential explanation here. I mean, these girls believed that they were being attacked by these witches, and so it's quite possible that their bodies did react in the way that they believed it because it was so strong in their brains that it was happening. Um, Arthur Miller's one of Arthur Miller's big points here is that there was a lot of personal vengeance going on, people accusing each other because they didn't like each other. There was jealousy, there was attention getting, and we're going to see that really early on in Act One when we read it. That there were sort of just community issues that were causing them to lash out at each other. Very, not supernatural at all very normal, but because of the society that they had created and that they lived in and what they believed, they lashed out at each other. Most widely accepted explanation for the Salem witch trials was the idea of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria happens when people's fear overcomes them and they react in really outrageous ways. The mass part of that is when it happens on a large scale within a society. The important thing to know about hysteria is it's based on fear. So in Salem in the 1600s, this community was scared. They were scared of anything outside of their very insular little community and their Bible and everything they believed. So when things seemed to be happening outside of their control, they reacted in a very visceral way, overreacted, and then it kind of took hold of the community and they started feeding off of each other, which made it all the more worse than it might have been on a singular individual level. Now, a little bit about Arthur Miller. He's the author of The Crucible. He was born in 1915 and he died in 2005. In fact, the first time I read The Crucible when I was in high school, he was still alive. I remember watching a video of him giving an interview fairly recently at that point. He was a writer, obviously. He wrote plays, screenplays, fiction, and nonfiction. He's most widely known for his plays. In particular, The Crucible is a big one. Death of a Salesman is another big one. That's probably my second favorite thing to teach beyond The Crucible. And he wrote another very popular play called All My Sons. But in reality, he wrote dozens of things. These are just the ones that he's most well known for. He was married for a time to Marilyn Monroe. little tidbit of interest about him in the 50s or 60s. And he was famous for his involvement in the McCarthy trials of the 1950s. And I'm not sure how much you guys know about the Red Scare and the McCarthy trials, but that's really kind of a big deal as we read The Crucible, because The Crucible was published in, I believe, 1953, and it was a direct reaction to this. So in the 1950s, the U.S. Had a strong anti-communist movement. We were concerned about Russia and China and all of the USSR and whatnot, and their communism spreading to the West. So the U.S. very much wanted to uh, nip that in the bud before it came here. In the 1950s, people were scared of communists. They started to point fingers at those suspected of being communists or communist sympathizers. They created this House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate these accusations. And a lot of artists, writers, directors, actors, Hollywood folks were targeted because of their liberal viewpoints. Oh, you're one of these, loosey-goosey liberal Hollywood elites. You must be into communism. And so Arthur Miller was one of these people who was targeted. He was asked to give a list of names of friends who were communists in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he refused. He said absolutely not, and he was charged with contempt of court, which means he would not comply with what they wanted. So he wrote The Crucible as an allegory, and an allegory is a parallel. He used the Salem witch trials as a parallel to what he experienced in the 1950s. He said, hey, we look back at Salem and think they were crazy, but look what we're doing right now in the middle of the 20th century. This was all very intentional, and he was very plain about his goals with The Crucible. It was no secret. It's not us reading into his purpose. This is truly what he was trying to do, and he has spoken about it. He wanted to prove a point that our country was still susceptible to hysterical behavior, even in the most modern of times. Before we read The Crucible, it's important that you understand dramatic license and how this relates to history. It's not strictly factual, okay? Yes, the Salem witch trials happened, but this is a dramatization. Changes had to be made for the sake of telling a cohesive and interesting story. History is great, but it's not always something you want to see played out minute by minute on stage. So drama requires a little bit of changing on the part of the author. Characters in this play are based on real individuals. If you go to Salem, you'll see these names on the headstones. However, some relationships have been created, some ages have been altered. For example, in real life, Abigail was very young and John Proctor was a little bit older. But the ages, for purposes of storytelling, the ages of the girls got raised a little bit, so they were more teenager-ish. And the relationships that Miller is putting forth here are not historical. They are dramatic based on his interpretation of events. The timeline has also been compressed. So the actual Salem witch trials lasted for a little over a year. In this case, they run over the course of about 6 months, from like spring to fall. And that is a real quick 15-minute overview of The Crucible. I look forward to reading it with you guys tomorrow. Within the next couple of days, I think you are really going to enjoy it.